So I just shared this image earlier, and now I'm going to be sort of talking about it, as I think doing it audibly is easier than over text. Some context to start with. I'm going to say I'm just going to be using the base sort of normal designs in my own story. They'd probably be their own designs, but whatever. So some context with Megatron first. As like most, or not most, but some stories, he's going to have his sort of antimatter abilities. So this is of course what he looks like normally, and then I imagine his when he uses his antimatter, his body would probably look more like the Megatron X design from Cyberverse. But because in reality, if antimatter comes into contact with normal matter, it just gets completely destroyed. Of course, this is fiction, so we don't have to go by real life rules. If he stays in this form for too long, he will just start to basically decompose and die. The current point that this story that I'm about to mention will take place will be in a point after the war where Optimus and Megatron are sort of friends again. Megatron sort of went through this whole arc where he sort of left the Decepticons, was a lone wolf for a while, joined the mercenaries, and then eventually had to team up with Optimus for something. And then they sort of ended the war. Optimus in a sort of star convoy inspired design, whereas Megatron's in a sort of Machine Wars Megatron style design. So that's sort of the setting. I imagine that they'd probably be teachers in a school, sort of teaching a new generation of Cybertronians, but that's not really necessary for what I'm talking about here. Another small piece of context is that I do have a Shattered Glass story that, if I were to be telling this story, would be told at roughly the same time as this stuff. For the real meats and potatoes of this story, there'd be a sort of what-if style story where Megatron gets his hands on the Matrix of Chaos, I'm basically calling it, the thing that creates Nemesis Prime and Rodimus Unicronus in my story. So he'd get the Matrix of Chaos, and it would essentially mean that he's able to stay in this sort of antimatter powered up form permanently. And it would mean that he's able to just wipe out the Autobots. This would leave Megatron feeling empty, and he basically scours across the universe, sort of taking over as many planets as he can, until eventually he discovers the multiverse and decides to start conquering other universes. One thing I should mention about this guy actually is that after killing his universe's version of Optimus, he decides to wear the Matrix around his neck on a chain as sort of a trophy, similar to Galvatron in the '86 movie. After discovering multiversal travel, he makes his way to a Shattered Glass universe, the previously mentioned one. And he does start to wipe out different characters, but it turns out maybe it's not as easy as he originally thought. As you see, Megatron actually ends up getting the Matrix that Megatron X is carrying round his neck, which ends up turning him into a new version of Galvatron. Of course, the Shattered Glass version. And for Optimus, after a pretty bad defeat, he sort of ends up in space. And he ends up coming into contact with Shattered Glass Unicron, who of course is much more benevolent in this universe, and he reformats him into Nova Prime. Of course, not the same Nova Prime from the base universe, but that's just the name he goes by as his upgraded form. Some of his evilness would be dampened down a little bit. I imagine he'd still be very aggressive and still definitely evil, but now he's got a bone to pick with Megatron X. So Megatron X would flee that universe, attempting to sort of like lock it off, I guess, but he doesn't do so well. Ultimately, Megatron X finds his way into the main universe and starts beef with this version of Optimus and Megatron, who of course would now be working together. And as I alluded to, he did not succeed at locking off the Shattered Glass universe, which brings us to here, where we have Optimus Prime, Megatron, a Matrix of Leadership powered Optimus Prime, Megatron, a Matrix of Leadership and Unicron upgraded Nova Prime and a Matrix of Leadership powered Galvatron versus Megatron X. I guess I should also mention that Megatron X would have a massive army of perfect Decepticons. Of course, Cyberverse Tarn, essentially. But they're mindless, powerful but mindless, and relatively easy to defeat with brute strength. I imagine that Nova Prime would probably end up sacrificing himself to defeat Megatron X. But I actually think a similar thing to Cyberverse would be quite interesting, where his universe's version of Astro Train, who I imagine would be like Titan size, would sort of end up imprisoning Megatron X inside of him and sort of just imprisoning him in the void, as I imagine this version of Astro Train would feel quite guilty for some of the things he's done under Megatron X's command. Galvatron would return back to his homeworld, but I think he'd also give the Matrix of Leadership back to Megatron X's homeworld for someone to use and hopefully sort of restore peace to that world. But I think that's pretty much everything for this sort of small little story that I came up with for just one of the small arcs that would be later on in the series. This was originally where I was going to kill off my main version of Optimus, but after sort of thinking that this would be a pretty good place to end this Shattered Glass Optimus's arc, I'm going to have to push this off somewhere to something else. I'm really not sure how to kill off Optimus at this point, at least not properly. I also think this leaves the Shattered Glass universe in a pretty interesting place, because Megatron could stay in that body, but probably not. Probably go back to being Megatron. But the Autobots, Rodimus Prime could take up the mantle of Autobot leader, which still leaves potential story to be told.